Okay, so I think we have a critical mass. So I'll get us started so that we don't delay any further. Um, First of all, thank you so much for joining us today. Um, this is yet another really critical and important episode, I think, that we have in our Arab Foundations Forum speaker series. If you're not familiar with the speaker series, this is 1 hour episodes where we host and speak to people who are working. Um, in any aspect of the philanthropy sector, focusing more on Arab philanthropy and the Arab region, but really just trying to host a series of a little bit more of an intimate conversation with people so that we're getting to know the people behind the action, and not just the work itself, which is obviously very, very critical, but really just getting to know a little bit more, delving a little bit more deeply into what motivates people to do the work that they're doing, and to get a bit of a kind of more intimate understanding of what goes into the work that we do. So we launched the speaker series, gosh, I think now it's been almost 2 years. Um, and over the course of the last 2 years, we've had several different conversations that have really touched on a lot of the work that's going on in the region, and in a lot of different parts of the sector. So we've talked a bit about entrepreneurship. We've talked a little bit about Gaza, obviously, and Palestine and what's happening there. We've talked about some philanthropy around Sudan, and other crises, but then also talk to individuals to understand a little bit more about, again, like what motivates the personal um, behind the philanthropy. So today, we're delighted and thrilled to be talking to Andrew Moore, who joins us from the Halo Trust. And Andrew is um, the director for Middle East, North Africa, and Afghanistan at the Halo Trust. I'm going to let Andrew kind of talk us through a little bit more about, what the Halo Trust does and who he is. But a couple of things that I think kind of stand out to me, just first and foremost, when you read Andrew's bio, and I'll let him explain a little bit more about the trajectory of his career, because Andrew is a former professional opera singer, which isn't usually the kind of background that you encounter when you're dealing with somebody who works in demining. And Andrew's worked with the Halo Trust since 2005, so it's about 20 years now. He's managed demining operations across many different countries, including Mozambique, Angola, Afghanistan, Kosovo, Georgia. Um, and he was also at one point the director of private fundraising and communications at the Halo Trust. So I think what I'm, definitely going to start off with, I'm going to want to know a little bit more about this opera, the career arc from opera singer to demining expertise. But one of the things that I think is also really important to know before we get started in this conversation about the Halo Trust, is Halo is the world's largest humanitarian mine clearing organization. And its mandate is it removes the deadly debris of war to protect lives and make land safe for people. And it's usually the first step towards recovery, reconstruction, security, prosperity. Um, the Halo Trust was established in 1988 in Afghanistan and now has over 12,000 staff in 30 countries. Um, and what's notable about this as well is that about 98% of Halo Trust's staff is hired locally, which again, as part of the larger sector conversation that we're having about localization and what does it mean to locally empower communities, this will be something that I'd also like to hear Andrew talk a little bit about. Um, I don't know a lot about demining. I do know the kind of how it came to my consciousness was in the 90s with that very famous picture of Lady Diana kind of walking through, or Princess Diana rather. I know her as Lady Diana because I'm a child of the 80s. So I knew her before. Um, but walking through a minefield, kind of like that solo walk, and that was sort of my first introduction to the concept of demining. Um, and beyond that, I don't really know very much about it, and that's sort of why we really thought at this point, and we're particularly looking at the context of Syria, you know, with with the situation in Syria now, post civil war, or at least post the bulk of the civil war. with a lot of Syrians thinking of returning, with sanctions being lifted in Syria. There's going to be, obviously this is an opportunity for a reconstruction and rebuilding of the country. But the first step in doing that is also being able to make the land safe for people to come back. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. First of all, to say welcome and thank you so, so much for joining us. Um, and yeah, just, get us started by telling me a little bit more about how you went from singing opera to this incredibly important work.
Thank you, Naila, and thank you for having me today to talk. It's a real pleasure to join you, and I really appreciate all of your members who are listening in as well, taking the time to listen. So, yeah, it's not a typical path to becoming an NGO worker, especially one in landmine clearance. I did actually do an electrical engineering degree before I went to music college, and I actually was sponsored by a local steelworks in the northeast of England where I lived. So I spent time working within that steelworks. It was fairly hands-on work. And then, but I had a voice, and I felt I had something to say, and I ended up going to music college after the university, and then I worked for 5 years as a professional opera singer. I think you could say all sorts of things about how I could have managed my career, but it's a tough career. It's an extremely tough career. It's a pyramid, and it was clear to me I was likely to spend most of my career in a chorus, which could be incredibly fulfilling at times, but also it could be incredibly dispiriting. And I was looking for something else to do, and I didn't know what. And I was on a London bus, and I saw an advert in a magazine for the Halo Trust, and the Halo Trust has kind of broken the mold of landmine clearance. It used to be a very military specialist preserve. You had to be an ex-soldier to come and do it. But actually clearing a landmine is quite a simple and straightforward thing to do. And just as we train our local staff in all the countries in which we work to do that, and we add skills so they can deal with other explosives, we do the same with our international staff. So I applied for the job. And 2 months later, I found myself on my hands and knees learning how to clear landmines on a very dense minefield in northern Mozambique, in a beautiful site overlooking the Rovuma River in Tanzania. And I think the really engaging thing there was living with my colleagues and my Mozambican colleagues who were doing the work, learning amongst them, learning from them. But also seeing how this minefield that had been laid 30 years earlier by the Portuguese when they were the colonial power in Mozambique, how we cleared a stretch of minefield and a week later someone was building a house there or the land was being farmed. And just to see that immediate impact was incredible. And I see it again and again and again through my working life. But that's always stuck with me. And it's I think one of the key reasons that's kept me doing this.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's one of the things that I think you really like. It resonates with me when you say about that immediate impact, because it's one thing to do the kind of work where the work is very critical, but it might take many, many years to see the outputs and the outcomes of that work, or to see kind of, the impact of that work. But there is a special kind of reward when when the reward is so instant, and you can actually in real time kind of see how you're literally changing lives or helping to improve people's lives. Um, can you, I mean, this is one of the things that I think is always interesting for me when I'm talking to people who do this kind of work, which is always very, it's very urgent work, it's very important work. The sense of responsibility and the onus of responsibility that is put on your shoulders is really just, it's quite intense. And I just wonder, you know, you guys Halo works in countries where often many others can't or don't, for whatever reasons. And I'm just curious to know, first of all, like, what is a typical day for you in this, in this work that you do? And then what have you learned about um, what kind of skills you need to, in a leadership position that is specific to contexts that in crisis like Syria. The Syria crisis is something so fresh and so new in terms of like the post, the reconstruction phase of it, versus other places where you still continue to work in countries, and you still continue to engage in demining in countries that maybe those conflicts have ended several decades ago. And so if you could just talk a little bit about that, because I just think that that's such a unique context to be working in.
Okay, so there's a few questions there, so I'll take them one by one, and do let me know if
Please.
I miss anything as well. So I think a typical day. I mean, I think the first thing is there isn't a typical day. This is such a varied job, and when we interview people who are looking to enter the organisation, we always talk about how you can be on your hands and knees dealing with explosives in the morning, coming into the office, showering before going into a meeting with a government minister, or going to an embassy reception in the evening. It really is, it covers the whole range of hands-on activities, managing people on the ground to dealing at a more senior level. My days, I'm trying now. The region that I work in has recently grown. We've merged and restructured, so I'm trying to deal at a more strategic level, and so
Mhm.
I'm trying to talk to donors and overseeing the overall direction of the region. But that still means, that I get involved on the ground. And 2 weeks ago, I was looking at the minefields that we need to clear in Syria. I was driving around the communities where there's unexploded ordnance amongst the rubble that's going to inhibit the reconstruction of Syria. A few weeks before that, still during the ceasefire, I was in Gaza conducting explosive hazard assessments, so assessing buildings for the risk of explosives within them. So I still get to do that as well, and that's really important, because I think that links into your question about values, and the importance of leadership and being seen to be on the ground, being able to talk to the people who are doing the work for Halo, but also the people who are living with the landmines. And we spent a couple of hours in Syria talking to a man who is living between two. There are the former front lines stretch for 200 kilometers, and pretty much the whole front line is mined, and there's a second front line behind that. His land sits in the middle of there, and he was upset about his land not being cleared, but the needs are overwhelming. And I think that will touch into some of your last question about how we deal with Syria versus some of the older problems that we're dealing with. I think in terms of values, I think so. I've touched on leading by example. I think that's really important. But it's not just about being willing to visit and do the work. It's also about living the values that you expect. The way in which you comport yourself when dealing with everybody. I think that's important. And we talk a lot about humanitarianism, but I think, remember, just basic humanity as well, I think, in these situations. But I think the other thing is to try and understand people, to try and understand the lives they're living, what they're coping with, why they think the way they do. So it's having the space to really understand the people who you're working for, because we're working for our beneficiaries. So I think those are really important things in terms of values. In terms of our staff, I think it's really important they have, especially in the circumstances in which they've lived, that they have you give them as stable an environment as possible. That's sometimes challenging. We're facing funding challenges at the moment, not least from cuts around the Western world. But it's important to provide that where we can. And then, how do we deal with Syria versus some of the longer standing problems? I think the real challenge for us in Syria right now is the sheer scale of the problem. And I talked about that 200-kilometer long front line with mines in between. Then the cities that have been devastated. Every building that has been bombed might have some unexploded ordnance inside it that needs to be dealt with when the people rebuilding that site get to it. And so having that capacity at scale right now. So right now, in Syria, we're thinking about how we can maximize benefit without necessarily clearing mines right now. That front line, perhaps 40% of it contains no landmines. So how can we identify which bit doesn't contain the landmines, so the people who want to farm that land can? And then how can we work with other organizations so that the people who have mined land perhaps can have an alternative livelihood until it's cleared? Whereas in places like Afghanistan, where it's a much longer standing problem and we're much more used to it, it's much easier for us to work methodically, from area to area. There aren't the land pressures perhaps in Afghanistan that there are as well in Syria, or that there will be as we see more and more people return. So the Syria crisis is very current, and has for the next 2 years I see it as having slightly different needs to places like Afghanistan and Iraq, where we've been clearing mines and other explosives for a longer period of time.
Mm. And so, okay, I mean, how do you determine what is, and like what's the mechanism and the technology that's required to be able to do that? That's one question. But a follow-up to that, as you're kind of telling me, this sounds really I mean, well, now I'm going to sound very naive, but this sounds like very dangerous work, Andrew. Like, I mean, you're saying, I didn't realize, for example, that you had gone into Gaza. I didn't realize that you were even able to go into Gaza. And just that alone seems like an extremely dangerous thing. You're literally putting yourself, it seems quite regularly, at very, very high risk. So those are, two questions kind of, I guess I would ask the last one first, which is, what is the degree of danger that you're actually in on a regular basis? How do you determine, I mean, how do you decide that do you have kids? Are you a father? Do you have children?
I have 2 children, yeah, 13 and 11, yes.
So how do you take that calculation to decide, okay, this is worth it for me? Um, and then how do you determine the level of risk? And then the last part would be, what is the technology that's required to be able to figure out where there are mines that need to be um, dealt with? I don't know what the word is.
So there are two levels of risk to deal with. Firstly, there's the risk of the devices themselves, which are fundamentally dangerous. So landmines, of course, are designed to kill and maim people, as is explosive ordnance, which, when we're dealing with it, it's either been abandoned, which means it may be relatively safe to deal with, or it's been fired, but it hasn't functioned as intended, in which case it's very dangerous. So we have extremely rigorous standard operating procedures derived from the military. We have various skill levels that we train people to, that allows them to deal with different levels of explosive threat. And if you were to visit, I think everybody thinks of when you think of landmine clears, you probably think of Hollywood dramas like The Hurt Locker, where it's a tense environment. Everything we do is calm, methodical. It looks more like archaeology or farming than those military environments. So it's a very calm environment. It's not without risk, but if standard operating procedures are followed fully, and we're managing to maintain the command and control of those procedures, then it's a pretty safe thing to do. Of course, there is then the security risk as well, which we manage very carefully. You touched on Gaza. When I was there, it was during the ceasefire. We did actually start working in Gaza pre-ceasefire, when there was a relatively safe space in which we could base ourselves, and in which we could operate. But as soon as this ceasefire ended, we did withdraw staff temporarily, because there isn't, and I think the UN said this the other day, there's no way. It's almost impossible to be safe at the moment in Gaza. It's slightly different in places like Afghanistan, where we worked pretty much continuously since 1988. We had a break for a month after 9/11, and we also had a break for less than 2 weeks when the Taliban took over, and we resumed work. And the issue there is about ensuring we have good community relations, that we're fully connected on the ground. We know what the security environment is. We have a strong understanding of it, and we're alerted to any shifts in that as quickly as possible. And of course, I talked about living values. Our staff are expected to go out there and in their everyday interactions with communities, with our staff, to embody the values of the organization that are the humanitarian values that we espouse, but also humanity. I think basic humanity is that. So that's really important. How do we identify mined areas? It's historically, it's largely been done. It's been done by analysis, talking to communities. Very often in a war like, for example, Angola's civil war, a lot of people were displaced, but many people remained in an area when the fighting was taking place. So they had a sense of where soldiers were positioned. They knew where landmines were based. perhaps they were part of an irregular unit as well and could talk to you about where landmines were used as well. So we would do often. It's a conversation with the community, trying to identify former combatants, to identify as narrowly as possible areas where there are mines. If we're going to an area maybe some years after the conflict's ended and not getting to survey it then maybe farmers will tell us where they ploughed up a mine, and that gives us an indication. Syria is going to have to be different. We're going to have to move much more quickly. The land pressures are so much greater, and we'll be using techniques that we've been developing elsewhere, but principally in Ukraine, and using drone imagery to photograph the areas, and then analyzing those areas to identify clear lines of mines. This is much easier when you have conventional militaries laying the mines, and the Syrian army was a conventional military. So we know there are patterns of mines, and we should be able to pick those out by drone, which will help us identify those areas first and foremost. There'll be some conventional survey as well, and we may do some risk reduction by running machines over the areas outside those minelands to give people confidence that the land is safe. But that's going to be a lot of the process in Syria, that new technology and different types of imagery, perhaps some thermal imaging, and perhaps even, we all get overexcited about AI, but perhaps even some AI to help with some of the analysis.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. I was going to ask if there's a role for AI in any of this. And I mean, I would assume that there would be. But so even, again, you were saying something else about the calculation of the risk and sort of what you guys have to go through, like any other humanitarian organization that's coming either in conflict or post-conflict. But what level of engagement, I assume it'd be a lot, but what level of engagement do you have to have, and what balance do you need to strike with governments, obviously, to be able to be afforded safe passage into a conflict zone? Because in the Gaza situation, and we don't need to focus too much on that, because I mean I think that's a whole other conversation, and it kind of it evolves into something a lot more complex. But even during a ceasefire, it's still an extremely dangerous position to be in. And I know I've spoken to heads of other humanitarian organizations who've had to have had to strike that balance with their work and the values that they hold, and having to negotiate with governments that are not necessarily always very friendly or trustworthy. And I think one of the questions that we wanted to talk with you about as well, and hear a little bit, so it relates to what I'm saying now, is about the trust that you build with a community that you're going into, especially communities that have been traumatized by years and years and years of conflict, and then having to kind of hand over the safety and security of their communities to an external entity, whether or not that entity has local staff working with them. So how do you strike that balance between knowing that you have to negotiate with governments that may not always be very friendly, but then also you're going into a community to help, make their lives easier, make their lives better, make their lives safer? What does that balance look like? What does that look like for you?
So I think the first thing to say is we can only operate with formal consent. So the formal consent of the authority, that the government of the country or the body that is responsible for it, and also with the consent of the people on the ground. So those two things aren't necessarily the same, but we have to ensure that we have both. Employing the right local staff, ensuring you have the right balance, especially in certain societies where you need, if you employ from one particular part of society, you may cause problems with the other. So ensuring we've got that breadth is really important. And then having that official buy-in isn't always easy, where you have authorities that are not officially recognized by perhaps by the governments of the countries in which we're based. The Halo is registered in the UK, the US, and The Hague as an organization. In the Netherlands, so we've got to make sure we manage that situation, whilst also being respectful, of course. So I think an interesting one is Syria before before December last year, before the fall of the Assad regime. And we were working in the northwest Syria with the consent of what was then the Syrian Salvation Government. But of course, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was a proscribed organization at the time. So we had to be very careful in how we balance that relationship, being able to have the consent of SSG without necessarily being engaged to a level that would have caused us problems elsewhere. I think another good example is the work we do in the West Bank. So we've been clearing minefields in Palestinian communities for the last 11 years. And these are mostly minefields that were laid either before or during the 67 war. But we're actually clearing a minefield right now that was laid by Israel post 67 and is on completely Palestinian-owned land with full Palestinian legal title. It's prime arable land, and all around that is land farmed by Palestinian farmers for wheat, etc. We work with the Israeli National Mine Action Authority because we have to. It's Area C. They're the authority responsible. But the Palestinian Mine Action Centre, part of the PA, is fully engaged in the process. It works with us fully in the liaison with the population on the ground. So there's that full ownership there from the PA of what we clear. And then at the end, the handover of that land to the owners is done by the PA. But the final thing is that land is subject to an Israeli closed military order, which strictly speaking makes it illegal for anyone to enter that land until the mines have been removed. And that closed military order is also removed. So there's no legal prohibition to the Palestinians using their land. So it's as our program manager often says, it's a rare project in the West Bank, returning land to Palestinian communities, and it's that constant level of engagement with the landowners, with the people who are going to use the land. That's what we have everywhere in the world.
And do you have any kind of formal process where, in this particular context, for example, so you facilitate the handover of land. And again, I mean, that's a very unique situation that you've just described, and really interesting to learn about, because I would have never heard about something like this. I think it's kind of incredible. But then do you have a formal process in place where you can follow up with what's happened post your exit? And is that part of what Halo Trust would do to entrench kind of trust building with a local community?
So we do post clearance land surveys. So we go back perhaps a year later and interview the landowners about the impact of the work, and that's largely donor led, so that we can report back to our donors what's been achieved, not just in physical terms in removing mines, but what's been achieved in terms of improved income, improved access to food and access to services. So we do that. In the West Bank case, it's been slightly more informal, in the sense that it's been a relatively small problem. We've cleared 13 minefields, and so we've on a regular basis revisited to see what's happened to those, but just in an informal way. I mean, a really interesting one is at Nabi Elias, where we have an office. And that was the first minefield we cleared, and it's been transformed. I mean, there are farmers growing avocados there, which is
Oh my God.
a pretty rare thing in Palestine. And so we've been back there several times, and we have systematically visited the other places. But it's been, I say systematically, it's been done ad hoc, really, from time to time, because it's a limited issue.
And when you say cleared a minefield, on average, how many mines are you talking about per field?
And I mean, that's how long is a piece of string.
Okay.
There are minefields that we clear 2 mines from, and the minefield I just talked to you about in the Jordan Valley, we know there are 20,000 landmines in a 5-kilometer strip. So there's it really varies. But the problem is, in some respects, 2 are more dangerous than 20,000, because if that's in a small patch of land, people will take risks until eventually someone
It hits.
one. But in the minefield with 20,000, people are not going to take the chances with those in the same way.
Right. And you had also mentioned when you were first talking about this in the beginning that the 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 level of danger of a mine itself depends on whether it's been fired. Okay, explain that. Just can you?
So that's not landmines. That's unexploded ordnance. So things like
Ah,
artillery
okay,
rounds, mortars, rockets, bombs, even anything that has been fired or dropped that hasn't
okay,
exploded as it was designed to do. And it depends on the circumstances, but failure rates are anywhere between 10 and 20% typically. So
okay.
everything dropped in a war or fired in a war, you somewhere between 10 and 20% of it will fail to function as intended. But it's left armed and sensitive to movement in most instances. So that's the real challenge. So children will often pick them up, or people rebuilding. What we've seen in Syria a lot is people, in order to get them out of the way, have dropped them into watercourses, down wells, into
Oh,
drainage ditches, and then you've of course got a new problem, because one, the well, that solves your problem for year one, but when the well needs to be maintained, you can't maintain it. Secondly, you've got the leakage of metal and explosives into the water supply. So
of course.
that then ultimately needs to be dealt with. But people know these things are dangerous and want to get them out of the way of their children. So it's a logical thing to do. Um,
Yeah. And how for how many years can a landmine stay active
I
and
mean,
in danger?
it depends somewhat on conditions. If they sit in water, they may degrade. But essentially they're sealed plastic units. And the landmines that were laid by the Argentinians in the Falkland Islands in boggy, peaty ground in the 1980s were still functioning when they were cleared a few years ago. We're
Wow.
clearing
Okay.
mines that are still working very effectively from conflicts in the 1970s and 80s. So landmines, while there is some degradation, there's not a level of degradation that can be relied on. They can
Wow.
we know
Okay.
they can continue to function for decades and decades.
Wow. Um, so there's two other kind of pieces of this that I'd really love to understand a little bit more from you. One is a bit more general and has to do with, well, you touched on this as well in terms of like funding and this crisis that we're all very aware of in the development humanitarian sector around the very significant cuts in funding from the global north. So I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about what has that in a real sense, in a practical sense, what has that spelled for the Halo Trust and the work that you're doing? What does it look like in the kind of immediate sense? What does it look like in the intermediate sense? And how is it going to impact your work and really just your funding in the future? And then with that, so that we can maybe inject a little bit of hopefulness into it, what would what are some of the things that you think we can do collectively as a sector um, to encourage a different, maybe a different way of funding, a different way of fundraising. Um, and then I'm particularly interested in whether or not the Halo Trust receives any funding from the Arab region, and if not, why not? And if yes, how can that be improved?
Okay, so the impact has been significant. Um, we overall, I think as an organisation, we have been affected less than many other INGOs. So we've been fortunate in that respect, but we're predicting a fall in income for the current year of between 25 and 30%. So
Oof,
that's
that's
fairly
big.
significant, and it's not affecting all regions equally. So for example, we're receiving funding for Syria at the moment. We're receiving funding for Gaza. Those are growth areas. However, Afghanistan, which had 2,200 staff in the middle of last year, we're down below 1,000 now, 1,000 Afghan staff. So it's been hit really quite badly.
Mm.
So it's as our chief executive says, it was an acute crisis at the start of the year, and it's morphing into a chronic crisis.
Oof. Mm.
So that is a real problem for us, because I think one of the things is that development funding is perhaps seen in the West as something that's perpetual. it goes on forever and ever. And what we do is genuinely finite. I talked about the when I trained in Mozambique and the people who were building houses and farming land 2 weeks later. You touched on Princess Diana, and everyone who will remember the image of her in Angola in a minefield surrounded by high levels of grass.
Right.
We took Prince Harry back there in 2019. It is a paved road with a school and a college and housing and shops and businesses, and you would never think there'd ever been you wouldn't think it was a rural area ever, let alone there'd been a minefield there. And most of the point, many of the people there didn't either remember the minefield or were born after it had been cleared. So most people
Mm,
weren't even aware of the Halo Trust, aware of the legacy, and so this is what we do is very different. So it
mm,
is finite, and we get rid of a problem once and for all. And I think you asked what's a different way to deal with this. I think somewhere like Syria probably points the way to some degree. I it's probably not a very elegant way of describing it, but I don't believe, despite the fact that the UN reports 90% of Syrians living below the poverty line still.
mm,
I don't expect Syria to become an aid sink for decades to come. I think
mm,
I was amazed. I was in parts of the northwest which were controlled by the regime 2 years ago, and the towns and villages were empty. Uh,
mm,
and already now there are markets, there are shops, there are people rebuilding. I mean, and really uplifting. There's people selling flowers and plants for gardens. The real hope that comes from that. And I think
mm,
we need to think about the investments to get people back on their feet. And of course, clearing landmines in Syria is definitely one of those. But all the things that will allow people to restart, and not necessarily this perpetual cycle of aid that we've developed as a concept perhaps in the global north,
mm,
something that we do. So that's probably one way we need to think about things differently. And I think thinking about longer term investments as well. I think one of the mistakes that's often made in the Western governmental sector is that we limp from grant to grant, from year to year, and having the ability to look at a problem over a number of years. And I think this plays into localization as well. If governments are genuinely interested in localization, it's no good providing funding pots for 1 year. You've got to provide a pot for 5, 6, 7 years that allows two partners to come together as equal partners and to build something that will last and be sustained, not something that will hang around for 1 year, and then next year you've got to compete for the funding again. And if you don't get it, it all falls apart.
right.
And then I think the final part of that is what can Arab countries do, and I think learn from the mistakes of what other governments have done, do it better. I think invest for the long term. The great thing is, of course, especially in the Middle East, you literally all speak the same language, but also you understand each other, and use that understanding to build more sustainable solutions, I would say.
And have you had funding from Arab governments and or from Arab philanthropy?
Not yet, but we're building a great relationship with the Qatar Red Crescent Society, and we're working hard both in Syria and Afghanistan, and potentially looking at elsewhere to build a partnership, so that we hope will lead to funding from Qatar eventually. So yes, so that is something that we're working very hard on. We're really excited about, and I'm really pleased that so is the Qatar Red Crescent Society as well. So
Yeah, of course. But I mean, look, it's a little bit uncomfortable. And I don't want to put you in an uncomfortable situation at all. But look, at the end of the day, the network AFF exists so that it can amplify these kinds of projects, these kinds of initiatives, these kinds of issues, and bring them to the forefront for conversation, for discussion, for analysis, etc. But really also to catalyze better Arab funding. And we hear this over and over, Andrew, in several different critical conversations around critical issues. When we come down to it and we talk about what does it look like for the sustainability of these initiatives and these projects and these programs and these organizations, many of whom work in the Arab region, and you delve just a tiny little bit below the surface, and there is no funding coming from the region.
Mm.
And this has to change. There's no point for our sector to be talking about localization in the context of Arab philanthropy if Arab philanthropy is not going to step up and actually fund the sector. I mean, it doesn't, there's no amount of kind of word gymnastics that we can manipulate to make it sound like, oh, we have a sustainability plan if the funding is not coming from the region for the region. So I just wonder, for an organization like yours, with the history that it's had, with the impact that yours is a very tangible impact. There is a narrative to be told. There are kind of follow-up stories. There's like long-term, an investment, and a case to be made for a long-term investment and all of that, because it's very tangible. You demine an area, you can show a kind of, a measurable impact on several different metrics. It's not a difficult case to make. So, I wonder, in a situation like that, what has been the barrier? What do you think has been the barrier, as diplomatically as you can? And I'm specifically asking about the barrier to getting Arab philanthropic funding. Forget the government funding for now, that's a whole different story. But Arab philanthropy, when we know the potential for Arab philanthropy and the amount of capital that exists to be deployed, what's the barrier to that?
I think I'd maybe turn it around slightly and from a Western perspective, say that I think we've not done things well as Western aid organisations. We see the Gulf region as an ATM, and if that's going to be your approach, you're never going to succeed. I think there's a huge amount of good work done by philanthropy coming from the Arab world. And if we're to knit it together with the rest of what we do, I think it's incumbent on us to better understand how to really engage philanthropists in the region. I think we need to understand what excites them, what sort of relationships they want, and ensure that we use their knowledge and don't just tell them this is what you need to put your money into, because I think that's bound to fail, and it has failed. So I think it's for us to learn as well. And I think Syria and Gaza in due course are in some respects game changers, because the extent of the problems that we see in our sector are such in both environments that everything that's done needs to be integrated with what we do. Frankly, it is really the case. If you're providing agricultural assistance, you need to take into account the threat from landmines and explosives. If you're rebuilding a hospital, you need to take into account the fact that there may be unexploded ordnance within the hospital, including unexploded bombs.
Mm.
If you're rebuilding any infrastructure, the power system, the power grid in Syria, for example, the water supplies in Gaza, you will need to take these things into account. So I think that for our sector, at least, as in when I say our sector, I mean the landmine clearance sector and explosive ordnance disposal sector, rather than the NGO sector more broadly. I think that they're changing the position, because such is the devastation, such is the extent of the contamination. We can't be ignored, and it's been recorded in Syria that around 1,000 people have died since the fall of the Assad regime from landmines and explosives. I think that's massive underreporting. It's open.
Mm.
I spent an afternoon in 4 communities in northwest Syria, and I was told of 2 accidents in the previous 3 days only, in which 2
Oof.
children had been killed and 3 injured with life-changing injuries. And as more people return from June, we will see this happening more and more. So what we do cannot be ignored, and it will need to be integrated with everything that's done, whether that's philanthropic, charitable, or commercial, frankly.
Right. So I, really, I really, really appreciate you kind of turning that around and talking about the responsibility of Western organizations in kind of understanding a bit more about the local context. And I appreciate that from so many different aspects. I mean, not the least of which is about the only way to, the only way to pave a real road towards localization is to live it, breathe it, and actually embody it rather than just kind of use it as a buzzword. Um, but to your point, you know, what what can organizations like the Halo Trust do differently then? Other than, learn a little bit more about local context and all of that, but what is the uncomfortable work that needs to be done in a context like this so that you are actually catalyzing local and you're deploying local philanthropy and also building partnerships that will help sustain your work. I mean, I'm just going to read you a comment from our chat from Shanuda, um, who is with Al Fanar, which is one of AFF's esteemed members, and Shenouda is in Egypt, lives in Egypt, and so he says for many years landmines in the Western Desert in Egypt from after World War II were stopping any development work in the area, and he makes this comment that your work is priceless for the development of economy and social life in many countries, and so I think this is like a comment of appreciation for the kind of work that Halo Trust does, and so in that in this context, what is it that you think organizations like yours need to do to be able to build these relationships that then will feed into a more sustainable funding stream and partnerships that work for longer, for better?
I think if we try to parachute ourselves in and say we've got all the solutions, then that will just turn people off. I think we need to ensure that we are part of the society, that we're having conversations, that we're learning, that we're responding to people's needs, so that it's more than just understanding; it's being embedded.
Hmm.
Just like we're embedded in Syria and we're embedded in Iraq and Afghanistan and the West Bank, we need to be embedded in the places where our philanthropists are as well, so that we understand their needs. I think the great thing about the relationship with the Qatar Red Crescent is it is the multiplier effect. It's not just the land that will be cleared; it will be the follow-on livelihoods activities that are done based on it. So that's a great way of catalyzing the relationship. But I think relationships with the universities are important as well. I think it's an extremely important part of especially the Gulf, but the whole Arab world, and so building those relationships so that we don't just work with institutions in the UK or the US, that we're working with them around the world, and fully understanding other perspectives, I think is really important. I think one of the great joys of my job is that I hope at my age I'm still open-minded enough to talk to people with completely different perspectives on the world, and understand why they have them. And I think that's what we need to do organizationally.
Right. And well, and I think also, I mean, it's interesting that you keep bringing up the the importance of embedding in the communities, and one of the other things I would venture to say, if I dare, that also your membership at Arab Foundations Forum is also one of those ways that you kind of are networking and connecting with, and I think it's so important to have this voice, um, of the kind of work that you're doing brought back to the network. And so I'll just tell everyone who's watching, before we launched into the episode, Andrew and I were talking about AFF's upcoming members meeting that we're trying to host every 2 years. And the next one is actually going to be hosted in December, in Amman in Jordan, where we'll bring together the network itself, but then also it's really open to anyone and everyone in the sector that's interested in engaging around these conversations. Um, and for every speaker episode that we've had, for every Gaza Chronicles episode that we've touched on conversations that I know cannot be dealt with in a 1 hour conversation. They really are like the beginnings of much longer conversations to bring in much more perspective. Um, and I feel like obviously, I think this is such a great start to a conversation about something so important, and especially in the time that you're in now, in the at least the two conflicts that you've touched on, Gaza and Syria, are such in such an urgent moment. So it'll be important for us to continue these conversations and kind of understand a little bit more about how the sector can help better support what you're doing, how it can do it a little bit differently. And to that point, Andrew, actually, how is Halo Trust generally funded?
So we're funded approximately two-thirds by government donors, and that's the US, the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, France, Japan, and some of the Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, and then roughly one-third by private foundations, mostly in the US and Europe.
Okay.
In fact, exclusively currently in the US and Europe.
Okay. Um, and then, so we have another question here. We have about 8 minutes to go, so I'm just gonna like as questions come in, or comments come in, I'll read them to you. Otherwise, I also have a few other wrap-up questions for you. But one question here from Andrew Scanlon, which is what's the breakdown of Halo's national and international staff in terms of overall finance? And then he says Halo is 40 years, has been, I guess, in some countries for 40 years. What is your exit strategy? That's a really interesting question. Um, as you're entering into like Gaza and Syria and kind of the exit strategy in a meaningful way. And then what other new countries is Halo entering into, or what areas of work are you expanding into?
So I don't know the financial breakdown. I do know the numbers though, very roughly. So until late last year, we had more than 12,000 staff in total. That's now dropped below 10,000. But fewer than 300 of those are headquarters or international staff. So
Okay.
I would need to check on the actual on the financial breakdown. And in terms of exit strategies, I think that is an interesting one. Afghanistan, which is the country we've been in for almost 40 years, we remain 80% of the landmine clearance capacity in the country, and so there isn't, if we were not there isn't a national alternative to really step in, and the instability and the corruption in the country has not led itself to the long-term support of donors to national capacities there. I think Syria, we should take a very different view. There's a lot. Let's not pretend that Syria can be cleared quickly. It's going to take time, but I think we need to be thinking as a sector. Once we're through an initial emergency phase, we need to be thinking about what is our exit strategy. Syria should be a country that can take over and deal with its own problem in due course. So I think that's something we need to be thinking of very carefully. We're not in Lebanon at the moment, but we are working with a Lebanese organization called Shield, and we do have. I talked earlier about how it would be good if donors could build longer term strategies to build local partners. We have an agreed relationship with Shield whereby we'll take 5 to 7 years to fully develop them as a landmine clearance organization with a gradual withdrawal of Halo's participation, so that it's just a very light touch towards the end. And so that's one of the things that we're looking at as a new territory in which to work,
Okay.
and doing so in a new way, so that we build a durable capacity for Lebanon. And the great thing about Shield is they're already a well-established NGO in Lebanon. They have a lot of donor support from Western governments, UN institutions, and naturally at the moment we're also looking at Sudan. And
Yeah.
we have a mission to Sudan, which will be happening in the next couple of weeks. And again, I think we need to think slightly differently there. I think there's obviously a landmine and explosive problem, but the immediate issue is getting aid into the country. And so how can we support the rest of the humanitarian sector in delivering that aid as safely as possible? And I think that should be our initial priority there.
And is that normally how you like, do you guys facilitate in that as well? Like other than the actual physical work of clearing mines in conflict areas or conflict zones, do you also work in concert with other humanitarian organizations to help facilitate safe passage?
We do. I mean, often we find ourselves in places where we're in quite remote places where there aren't a lot of other NGOs or NGOs generally. But yeah, if I think back to Angola shortly after the end of the Angolan Civil War, one of the only ways of getting aid into communities that were believed to be surrounded by landmines was for Halo vehicles to just drive first. Not
Wow.
just kind of proving the route. And we had armor plating on the vehicles. It's not an infallible means, but we did an awful lot of that. We did it in Cambodia as well, and it really is just a way of providing some assurance. We then in Angola we developed more methodical means for proving routes and allowing it to flow. But yeah, that's very definitely something that we do. In Sudan, I envisage initially it will be more advice and guiding people and joining NGOs as they deliver aid.
Yeah. And I guess, one of the things that's interesting about the the kind of strategy for an organization like Halo Trust is that you're one of those organizations that your real success is measured by how quickly you can get yourself out of a job,
Yeah.
right? I mean, um, the point at which we find that we don't need a Halo Trust is when you've really succeeded, right? Because you've been able to make the world safer for
If
so
you don't mind me saying, sorry, I know we're short on time. In Gaza, for
no,
example, I think
yeah,
our job will be done as quickly as Gaza's rebuilt. So
yeah.
if the Egyptian plan is 5 years, and we should be done and dusted in 5 years, frankly, or largely done and dusted. We're then onto a residual problem which Berlin has, for example. There are an estimated 4,000 World War II bombs buried in Berlin still.
Really?
So then that just is a problem that is dealt with as it arises. So the large scale capacity in Gaza, I think, should be a short term burst while the bulk of Gaza is rebuilt, and then it becomes a residual issue.
So hang on, you said 4,000
Estimated.
in Berlin, in the urban city itself.
Yeah.
Wow.
Two
And
two
these are
years ago,
just
2 years ago, 50 tons of unexploded ordnance were removed from Berlin city in the course of the year. Just stuff as it was found by construction companies and the local people.
wow. Okay. Okay, see, I would not have even imagined that. That's so interesting. Wow. Okay. So we have about a minute left, Andrew, and I do want to just ask you one last thing before we sign off, which is when you think about the work that you're doing, and you think about the engagement that you have with local communities and sort of, especially, obviously for us, Syria, Gaza, these are just such an, important, Sudan, honestly, just all very important um, regions in our geography and in our hearts. Um, and so I think there's no way to overstate the gratitude for the kind of work that you're doing and the kind of work that you're enabling other local communities also to do to keep themselves safe. But when you think about this work and you think about the future of this work, what are the points at which, what are the inflection points at which you find hope, at which you look and think, okay, we're moving in the right direction. Um, and I think particularly when it comes to local ownership of this work and local leadership in this work, where are the points where you see something optimistic?
I mean, I see a lot of hope still. Saw hope in those flower stalls in Syria that one of the first things to spring up are people wanting to plant their gardens, and of course that's fraud because if your garden's got landmines in, there's a problem. I see great hope in our local leaders who step up and we develop and move on to other countries to manage operations at a senior level around the world, and I think it's standing looking at a minefield that spread 100 kilometers in each direction in Syria. That's slightly overwhelming. That is really, really tough, and it's hard to see some of the hope. But then I go back to Afghanistan, and I drive around Afghanistan, and everywhere you go, there are schools and clinics and signs and places painted with Halo Trust
Mm.
places we've played, we've led to a transformation in rural areas that are forgotten by everyone else. And I suppose it's that transformation that gives me hope, because I know that we can deliver that in Syria right now. It's really tough, and I know in due course we can deliver that in Gaza as well. I think that's really important, that there is some hope, and it's a slightly different problem in Gaza. It's not landmines. It is being there to respond as people rebuild their homes and farm their land and find things. But I know it can be done, and I know it can be done forever. And I think back to that street in Angola with Prince Harry sitting there, and most of the people watching him not knowing there'd ever been a minefield there, and not knowing who the Halo Trust were.
That's incredible. Yeah, that's incredible. That's hopeful. You answered the question. I love it. Thank you. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Andrew. Really, this was so enlightening, very informative. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the time that you took to talk with us. Um, we've shared on the chat with everybody links about the work that you're doing, the work in Syria. Obviously, I extend an open invitation to anyone who's joined us today to reach out to us for any more questions. If there's anything you want to know more about, please let us know. We'll make sure that you're on our mailing list also, so that you can get our information about our members meeting. And if that's something that you're interested in joining, we would love to see you in Amman later this year. And Andrew, thank you so much. Um, and really also just gratitude for the work that you do and the work that your team of 10,000 at one point 12,000 people were doing. It's incredible work. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Niall. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much.